Hi, and welcome to another episode of Kristina's Not So Broken Brain. I am incredibly excited to be here today with Dawn Christman. And she was a connection that was made through another LinkedIn connection, which is always a wonderful example on why networking can be actually fun when people connect you to people. So I am going to now ask Dawn to introduce herself.
Thanks, Kristina. I appreciate you very much having me here today. So I have a great deal of experience in the human capital world.
Mm,
So the conversations that you and I've had and why you and I got connected, right, was because of my DE&I work, some of the different things that I've done in building TA teams. I've been in sales. So I have a lot of experience in all the different facets of the human capital industry.
yeah, and your background is awesome. So I love looking
Thank
at
you.
people. I know sometimes when you look at resumes of people who have been in different types of roles, and to somebody who doesn't have a similar experience, they might look at somebody's resume and be like, I don't understand how this stuff connects. Like looking at yours, I see branding, marketing, sales, and like talent management, DEI. Would you tell us a little bit about your journey?
Yeah, my journey is one I'm really thankful for, right?
Okay.
So I really started as a straight commission recruiter where
Oh,
you
wow.
really had to make things work by finding them yourself,
Yeah.
right? So for me, it was a great experience to help from how do you build your personal brand so people actually want to talk to you?
Mm.
How do
Ooh,
you make sure that you
yeah.
build the brand of the organization so people want to come work for them? Right.
Yeah.
So it was a great foundational experience for me.
Mm.
My journey started there, and I built from doing that work to custom building recruitment solutions to organizations to moving into a corporate capacity and actually building inside sales
Okay.
teams, TA teams, operations teams, working globally, and really have had a really phenomenal experience of having worked with talent all over the world in a variety of different capacities, right? I really don't think the world is a huge place, but it
Yeah.
really is not,
Mm.
especially now that we are so aligned in the technology space where everybody's doing calls like this.
Yeah.
It really is a
Yeah.
wonderful way and a huge advantage to tap into the experience and the skill sets of other people all over the world. And
Mm.
it's been great fun.
Yeah. That's awesome. So what are you into right now with that broad scope of experience?
Yeah, right now I'm an executive consultant, so I'm working with
Okay.
organizations and helping them from a DE&I perspective and building strategies. I'm doing mentoring for people that are in startups. I'm working into a new board position where I'll be working in leading an advisory board. So a lot of that consulting side and really
Mhm.
working to make businesses and people better and more productive.
Yeah. And that's the key word right there, right? Productive. I've
Mhm.
been thinking a lot about the word productivity lately. And as we're recording this, I just did a post today about how I'm breaking up with productivity in the toxic way, right? Like, meaning that I associate my value based on my productivity. And I know now that that's not true.
Mhm.
And a lot of clients that I work with one-on-one and with organizations, that's their big thing, right? Like I work with a lot of people who have some type of diagnosis like ADHD, autism, dyslexia, and their focus is on how to be productive based on everybody else's definition of productivity.
Mhm.
And they base their value on that. So with your experience, knowing that you work with DE&I and teams and human capital, when we think about some of those challenges like productivity, and when you think about what you do consulting based on that, what are some challenges that come up for you? This isn't something that we talked about, but now that I'm
Mhm.
hearing this, it's like
Yeah.
I'd love to hear how you approach it and what are some common challenges that organizations face along those lines.
So I think a couple things. I think you hit a point that is really interesting. I don't think productivity in everybody else's definition is how people should look at being successful, right? It's actually figuring out the skill sets and the strengths of the individuals and the opportunities that they have,
Mhm. Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
really understanding that. people are much capable of much more than they think they are. And it's
Yeah.
really, I've always kind of made it my personal goal of figuring that out and uncovering that. And I love doing that because it's so fun to see people thrive and really grow and develop and do things, right? Maybe that they weren't comfortable with doing before. So I do think you hit it on the head, right? The idea of productivity, more. Absolutely. You want to be
Mhm.
as productive as possible in the amount of time that you've got every day to
Right.
do this, whatever this job is,
Yeah.
right? What I think people miss is how do they maximize their skill sets in the amount of time they have to be the most productive? So I use some tools. I use a tool where it's a rolling action item log and a management operating system where I actually document everything that needs to be done, the timeline, who my partners are, what our
Okay.
goals are together, how we're going to make it happen. And what ultimately comes with writing those things down, when
Mm.
you write them down, and then as you and I were talking about earlier, just slow down and take a minute
Yeah.
and you read it,
Yeah.
then it becomes more and more impactful of, oh, wow, right? I need to do X, Y, and Z to get the outcome that I want in the time that I have, or I need to go back and ask for more time.
Mm.
Or I need to go back and say, guess what? We're ahead of time or ahead of the game. We don't need to do that. So I think to your question about what are organizations finding as a challenge, I think everybody works really hard to go really, really fast,
Yeah.
right? It is, they take an extra 5 minutes, write it down, look at it, make sure that you're not missing the points. And I think even more important than that is figuring out who your partners are
Mm.
and what part they play. And then doing that and having a conversation with people is another level of respect to them and to their time and what they're trying to accomplish,
Yeah.
that they'll want to work with you more.
Yeah.
Right? If you give people goals and numbers and plans and timelines that are completely unattainable, it doesn't make them feel good. It
No.
doesn't make them want to,
Mhm.
right? And then you're not going to get the output that you want to ultimately meet your goals.
Yeah. And that's a really good point where there's a lot of leadership workshops. I attended some of my own where it's like you reach for bigger goals than what you feel like you can attain, right? Because you don't know what you're
Mhm.
capable of. And on the other side of that, there's a toxic side, right? Where
Mhm.
it's like, I'm giving you these big, huge goals and like you reach them. And then you feel tiny when you don't hit them. And then they base bonuses on that, pay
Mhm.
raises, promotions. And a lot of times, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this, where when you have these huge goals that are unattainable, you might have some staff who reach them
Mhm.
at the detriment of other staff. And I'll give you an example. I worked a client facing job when I was just out of college after my year volunteering in Alaska. And I come back and we're working with people over the phone, giving like online tutorials for this educational tool. So one of our roles was also troubleshooting and supporting them in that tool. Some people, knowing that I did really well with troubleshooting and I enjoyed it, would transfer those calls to me. And you know
Mhm.
what that did not allow me time to do? Reaching out to my people who I was supposed to be doing, sales calls with. Instead, I
Mhm.
was helping their clients, which I didn't necessarily disagree to do, but I also didn't hit my goals. And it made me look like I was not doing and pulling my weight, but they blew it out of the water. And I was happy for them. And yet I felt like I was not a part of the team because I was
Mhm.
now putting in this support type role. So it's kind of like we've got these big audacious goals. Some people are able to take them and run with them, but at the detriment of other teams. Like, is that a dynamic that you've had experience with?
Absolutely. But I think it goes back to what we talked about earlier. You
Mm.
need to do a root cause analysis of what's happening,
Mm.
right? So if they're excelling over here,
Yeah.
you're excelling over here, they're
Yeah.
falling short over here. you're excelling over here, but you're falling short on your own personal goals, right? So you're falling here. So where's the disconnect?
Right.
What, and constantly, right? It is throwing it over the fence. And yes, everybody has that experience, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Everybody has that experience.
Yeah.
What I think though is a lot of times what's helped me is leveling the playing field. Like I've been on calls with people on big, long-term, global, highly interconnected technical projects, right?
Right.
And people from all over the globe were working on it, and it was not hitting goals and
Mm.
not hitting where it needed to be. And everybody was very concerned.
Yes.
And I got a group of people on the phone, and everybody was very quiet. They didn't want to talk. And I just said, okay, here's how it is. We all need each other. We have to do this. You have to do that. You can't do your job without us. We can't do our job without you.
Right.
So this is an open call. Lay it out on the table. Nobody's going to say anything about anything else. Let's just get it done.
Okay.
And it was an audible sigh of,
Yeah.
oh, so we can actually say what's not working. We can actually
Yeah.
talk about what's not. I'm like, I don't care.
Hmm.
Let's just get it done. And I think sometimes, it's fear. Fear motivates people and fear doesn't motivate people.
Yeah.
Right. And so the people transferring the calls to you wanted to do a great job and make their numbers. So they're like, I'm going to send it over to Kristina because she's awesome at this. And then I can go do this.
Mm-hmm.
But that was a detriment to you. So I think it's
Yeah.
probably a matter for me of sometimes it's that just stop for a minute
Mm-hmm.
and chunk it into bite-sized pieces. What's going on?
Yeah.
What's working? What's not? And I think also back to the how I manage my time and what I do and writing things down. When you look at things and actually identify, I've got these 5 players and I have this goal. But in reality, those 5 players are great, but I need a 6th and the 7th
Yeah.
because I don't have the expertise in here that I need. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, honestly, Kristina, to drive employee satisfaction, people satisfaction, even just giving somebody an opportunity to do something that they don't do every day,
Yeah.
it's a growth opportunity. And to your point, it's a feel good thing. Oh my
It is.
gosh, I love to do this.
Yeah.
I love to do this. Great. So maybe it's not part of your job, but we have this special project over here. Would you like to try to do that and see how it goes? And
Yeah.
that helps them with development.
Right.
So where your people kicked it over the fence to you,
Mm.
in reality, you did get a benefit out of that because you
Yeah.
learned and grew and able to do all, and now your resume got fatter and got better.
Right. Yeah.
So I think a lot of times you get around those things by
Mm.
looking at the root cause of what's happening
Mm.
and how you solve for it from that way.
Mm. And I love that perspective shift because it goes from like the victim mindset to empowerment mindset to say like,
Mhm.
hey, yeah, you didn't make your numbers over here. And the customer satisfaction numbers for these 3 people who sent the calls over to you increased because you solved their
Mhm.
problems immediately. Yeah,
Mhm.
those reactions are fun that pop up on Amazon. And so that's a really good, I love that mindset shift. That's a lot of fun. So when it comes to the DEI perspective, and
Mhm.
that's something that you have background in for a while. This is not a new thing
Mhm.
for you.
No,
Why don't you tell
no.
me a little bit about that part of your journey?
So that part of my journey really kind of started on a personal level. I have pretty much if you look at the definitions of DE&I between my family, extended family, and my friend group, I've got them all. I
Yeah.
mean, every single one. I remember in very early in my career, and I was at a conference, and there was a gentleman who was dressed just to the nines, right?
Yeah.
And he was in a wheelchair, completely paralyzed. He was using his chin to move his chair. He had one of those chairs. He had his resumes out. It was a job fair. It
Hmm.
was a diversity job fair. He had his resume out on his tray, and he had his partner, his helper, behind, and he would go up to each one of those employers and he would talk to them, partner would hand it over. And it was a incredible, impactful thing that I, I was a distance runner at the time,
Mm,
right? People said, why do you run? Why do you do this? Why do you do that? I'm like, because I can, right?
right.
To see
Yeah.
someone who had such a massive disability doing that, and it never left me,
Mm,
right? That never left me to see that. I've had so many experiences. I've been so lucky in my life to see people who are legally blind thriving in jobs, or
right.
people who are have neurological disorders who some days can't get out of bed
Right.
and
Yeah.
work to run a marathon,
Mm,
right? Or, just so many things that have impactful. I
yeah.
really believe that everybody deserves a place at the table. And
Mm,
instead of looking at someone who has something in the
yeah.
DE&I space as having something in the DE&I space or as it being a weakness, I look at it as awesome. So what can I learn from them? And
Right.
what's the strength that they have
Right.
that I don't have? Or how can I connect them to someone to actually help them grow, right?
Yeah.
Or even better, help them get another person to grow. So again, I really do look at it from a very different way,
Mm,
right? I
yeah.
think that I've been extremely fortunate to have the opportunity to meet the people in my life all the way around from a professional basis, a personal basis. That's just made me have more scope and depth as well.
Yeah. And that's amazing. That's a important story to really illustrate to other people. It's like you don't know who's watching
Mm-mm.
and
No, you
learning from
don't.
you, even when you don't necessarily have direct interaction with them. And it doesn't mean that you have to be, a banner for your particular disability or ability or, whatever range you have within the DE&I space. But what it means is that like you can inspire people and also break stereotypes is what I'm hearing too. It's a
Mhm.
lot of like, I never thought of this way. I never thought of how this could look or what that challenge would look like. I have read there was a Harvard Business Review article about the competitive advantages of disability, of hiring people with disabilities. There's a lot of things, in my personal opinion, that article gets wrong. And there's a lot of things that they get right. And so one of the ways that I think that they got it right is exactly what you said, where it elevates the strength. So there's a intelligence agency in the UK, and they actively try to recruit people with dyslexia because they did notice that people with dyslexia, especially in like the cybersecurity space, have a tendency to notice patterns in data that other people and systems don't catch, which is important in those spaces. And
Mhm.
it's really critical for not just go to market, but also for security in general. And so they actively do hire. SAP is the same way. There's a lot of SaaS companies. Microsoft has its own neurodiversity hiring, which is a different conversation. But in this article, it talks about the benefits. It also talked about there's a security guard organization or a company that hires security guards that are wheelchair based because they're able to go through malls faster and they typically have more upper body strength because pushing through in their wheelchair. And so they're able to get to shoplifters, to people to question, and they can maneuver through crowds and everything. And I'm like, okay, that's focused on strengths. Then they
Mhm.
have ones that they talk about in the article about customer relations, where there might be a situation where a customer is negatively, yelling at a customer representative in person, right? And then they say, I want to speak to their manager. And then they say, we have our customer relations manager come out and they're in a wheelchair and suddenly they stop yelling. So it's a
Mhm.
benefit because the people stop yelling. I was like, in that case, that's not based on their strengths. You're not
Mhm.
elevating based on their strengths. You're focusing, in my view, it's like you're focusing on the fact that people are uncomfortable with people with disabilities.
Right.
And so
Yeah.
which blew my mind that that was even in the Harvard Business Review article as an opportunity to leverage.
Mhm.
I was like,
Mhm.
I would love to know your thoughts on that since you were talking about strengths and stuff.
Yeah. So interesting. I had this experience not too long ago
Oh,
with someone who was in a wheelchair in a completely different space than
yeah.
that. And they just happened to be the individual that was at this conference and no one else was around. And it was running down some information for me that
Mm.
I knew they had to literally go and run down. And I had no qualms whatsoever about them going and running it down.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I will tell you, the reason I didn't is because they came across as, what do you need? I need this. No problem. Give me 5 minutes. Awesome. Can I meet
Yeah.
you back here? Yep, meet me back here. Phenomenal. And
Yeah.
and they got it done. And I think, again, it is sometimes people react to things because they just don't know what they just don't know. It makes them feel
Mm.
uncomfortable,
Mm.
right? It makes them feel it's something they're not used to. They don't have anyone around them that has the same kind of thing, looks the same, talks the same, is in a wheelchair. So they don't know how to react. And
Yeah.
sometimes it catches them off guard.
Mm.
And again, back to the point of fear,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
They react because they're fearful because they don't know how.
Yeah.
So I think the idea of it, and some of this I will tell you, I met a really interesting person once that had ADHD, and they had a sweatshirt on that instead of ACDC, it was ADHD. And it was, right, it was the coolest sweatshirt. I loved it. But they had worked really hard on flipping the script
Yeah.
of ADHD being a superpower
Mm.
versus something that wasn't.
Right.
And I think, that has a lot to do with it. It is the person who's in the situation, the person who's being impacted the situation, and how do they both feel,
Yeah. Okay.
and meet in the middle,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And I agree with that. And it reminds me of the comparison of, you don't judge a fish's capability based on how well it can climb a tree.
Mhm.
Like
Right,
it's like
right.
it, and I know that that is kind of like a variation of that, but one of the things that I find really interesting, especially as somebody with dyslexia and ADHD myself, is the balance between superpower and disability. Because yeah, there are some days where having the brain that I have is a struggle. It just is. And I
Mhm.
have coping strategies and I have tools that I work with that I've created over the past several years after I was a late diagnosed person. And so that's something that I'm still struggling with. Elevating, it's like, yeah, there are things that I'm challenged by. And then there are things that I do believe are, I won't say easy for me, but are kind of a superpower. And what I've been able to settle on to give myself some grace is that I realize it's like everybody has their own struggles. So therefore, I am allowed to have my own struggles. And it's
Absolutely.
okay if those look different from what people expect them to be,
Absolutely.
even if it's what we call, invisible disabilities, right? Like you
Mhm.
wouldn't notice when I'm just like walking through the mall. Do people still walk through malls? Going through the mall, yeah, I don't know, that, I've got a disability and I'm challenged by certain things. So I think that's something that people struggle with, and fighting that stigma and being present and being able to have those conversations is important. And as always, it doesn't mean that just because you've met one person with ADHD, autism, who's in a wheelchair, it means you've met one person with those
Right.
types of challenges. So something else in the DEI space that we talked about previously was this thought, or this phrase I wasn't familiar with, called social mobility.
Mm.
That and that after you explained it to me previously, I like so many light bulbs went off. But if you would explain
Mhm.
what that is again, because that's something that you are familiar with and you work on in your work as well.
Yeah. So I think a couple of things just to add on to what you just talked about. I always tell people, right? I've been very fortunate to have phenomenal teams and talents that I've had the pleasure of partnering and leading.
Yeah.
And I always tell people, you don't know. what's going on in that person's life. You don't know what's going on in their world. Everyone has challenges. Just give them the benefit of a doubt. And I think that goes a long way. And I think to dovetail into social mobility, I think that's very, very prominent, right? Social mobility is working your way into a better situation in your career, in your life, than maybe you had the opportunity to grow up in. So my story, and you know this, Kristina, I share this a little bit, right? My mom grew up with one pair of shoes and one dress to go to school every day, right? Really had a great deal of poverty. And I never knew anything different, right? I never thought anything different. But ultimately, I came out of a situation where I was the first person in my family to go to 4-year college. I've worked all over, worked globally, traveled all over. I really have had a great opportunity.
Right.
So social mobility, the idea of it is, in my mind, really is helping the next person back to the original point of understanding what their strengths are, and then being respectful of where they came from and what they are and what challenges they might have, but then saying, okay, game on. How do we help you take this and use that as fuel to get you to the goals that you want to do? And you don't need to have, to your point, you don't need to have you starting here and your goal up here.
Right.
Your goal can be up here.
Yeah.
But let's take bite-sized pieces.
Yes.
So to your point as well, you don't feel like you're failing, right? Because maybe you come from a situation where you couldn't finish school, right? You couldn't finish school, or you couldn't afford to go to college. Well, there's phenomenal opportunities out there for you that you don't need some of those things, but you need someone to help you get to those places.
Absolutely.
Right? And to understand those things.
Yeah.
So I think from a standpoint of everybody has an opportunity, but it has to be the people around them and surrounding them to help them get there.
Yeah.
Right.
So what I'm hearing you say is community and the people you surround yourself with is really important.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so.
Oh man. Yeah. So growing up, I definitely had instances in my own life where it was like my family worked really hard to buy a house in like the good school district, right? And that we had that concept of like the worst house in the nicest neighborhood you can afford. Totally fair. My parents did everything they could. And it was one of those things where it's like you notice as a child the differences in living style when you start going over to friends' houses, right? It doesn't mean that you feel bad about yourself. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Maybe you see it as an opportunity, and everybody's perspective on that is different. I think for me, it was seeing how some of the people whose houses I went over to, they had similar stories like mine, where they, grew up and their parents, lower working class and doing the best that they could. And they surrounded themselves and got opportunities. And some of them were the first people, they were the first to go to college, and they were the first to have, 2-income household. And so they worked. And so being able to have conversations with people and not make those assumptions, like you just said, of like who they are and what they represent, can be really powerful, because you can utilize, they can be that stepping stone for you. And so that's what happened.
I think also, the things that I grew up and how I grew up have never left me, right? That is just ingrained in me, right?
Yeah.
I still do all the things that I grew up, gardening, canning, right? All the things that we talked about, the things that maybe aren't the fun, exciting things that people do, but I would never not, because that's how you learn. And I think that having that foundational, I mean, there's a big piece of humility that comes with all of that you never, ever, ever lose. And maybe that's why I see it as so interesting to learn about everybody else and everything else because,
Yeah.
I work really hard to be very respectful of folks,
Yeah.
but the rest of it, yeah, okay, great. I'd love to get to know you. I'd love to understand what you're about. I'd love to understand your background. Let's talk about it and figure out where I can help and how I can complement versus thinking, to your point, you're different. No, you're
Yeah.
you're different. Awesome. Let's figure it out. Let's talk. Right. So I think it's a different way and that just stays ingrained. Right.
Mm. That reminds me of a poem that I really resonate with, and depending on like it's a faith-based poem,
Mhm.
and I grew up like holding it close, very dear. It's called "I Stand by the Door," and so basically, it's like I don't go too far in, I don't stay too far out, but I'm there to hold open the door for basically saying for people who are wanting to go in, but also to encourage the people who are in that it's safe in there and you can stay even if it's uncomfortable sometimes. And so that poem always gave me chills, but it was always, regardless of my faith journey, it gave me perspective to say, it's okay for me to be this in between. Sometimes
Mhm.
I'm not all the answer. Sometimes I'm not nothing, but sometimes I'm just here to connect and give people perspective and to support and to give them that
Mhm.
next step up. And that's okay. And that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, you can't be everything to everybody. And
Yeah,
if you try, you're just going to disappoint yourself,
absolutely.
right? And
Yes.
I think the really important point of that is if you try to that person that you're trying for,
Yeah.
maybe nobody ever tried for them,
Ugh.
right?
Yes.
And maybe they're thinking you're thinking you put so much effort in and they're thinking, wow, right?
Yeah.
Nobody else ever did this. Or
Yeah.
maybe your eighth of effort is means a mile to them. So again, you don't know
Absolutely.
the
You don't.
situation of the people around you.
Yeah.
And a lot of
Absolutely.
times, even if you ask, it takes a long time until somebody trusts you enough to tell you what's
Hmm.
going on.
Absolutely. And I love that. And I will leave with this very brief story of an illustration of what you just said. I was in middle school, Girl Scouts, and I had never seen any local government function. I was growing up in San Antonio, hadn't seen women in leadership really. And one of the things that they allowed us to do was I got to miss school and go to a city council meeting. I
Huh?
forget it was like Girl Scout Day and there were a bunch of other people there, but only certain representatives of Girl Scout troops could go. And I was told that I could go. And there was this parent chaperone representative who picked me up. They probably took time off work or taking care of their kids to drive me to this thing. Completely changed my view. Like I sit on a town board now where I live, like I'm an elected official. I do lots of different things in my community, but it was like that little fire that was
Mhm.
put in me, and they talked with me on the way there and on the way back, and I don't even remember their name, but that was enough just to ignite. There are people like me who serve in lots of different ways, and
Mhm.
elected official is something that people do.
Mhm.
So I think that,
That's awesome.
yeah, and so that was incredible to me. Well, Dawn, I want to say thank you so much for coming on the podcast today and sharing your experience. I could talk to you for hours about all of your experience, and I'll
Well,
probably
thank
have to
you.
have you back
Thank you.
because I'd
My
love to.
pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we'll have to dive into other stuff, but thank you so much. And I'll talk to you very soon.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Christina. Much appreciated. Have a great day.
Thanks. You too.